Trumpets, Bugles and Drums of the British Army, compiled by Francis Dillon and presented by Lieutenant General Sir Brian Horrocks, with James Blades and J.W. Waters.
Of these three military instruments, the trumpet, the bugle, and the drum may claim to be the most ancient. Drums made 5,000 years ago still survive. There's a vast amount of myth and legend about the drum, and there's an aura of magic about it as well. You could feel the magic yourself when you hear the drums on parade. My regiment, the 57th Foot, have always been particularly proud of our Corps of Drums for their heroism at Albuera in 1811, during the Peninsular War. This was the battle where the regiment earned the name of Diehards. We still celebrate it every year on May the 16th. Now what happened was that Wellington had gone north and left Beresford at Albuera to fight a delaying action and prevent the French under Marshal Soult from relieving the siege of Badajoz. Unfortunately, Beresford was not a very good tactician. Soult was too clever for him, and while drawing most of his forces to the centre, he developed a movement round Beresford's right flank. My regiment was sent at the double to hold us up. They were just in time, and formed up in two ranks, faced by a far stronger French force. Time after time, they beat back the French attacks, but their losses were extremely heavy. On our right flank was the Corps of Drums, many of them quite young boys, and under the intense enemy fire they began to waver. The CO, Colonel Inglis, had been badly wounded, but he refused to be evacuated to the rear. And realizing that the drums might give way, he called out, "Steady the drums and fifes." Now this became the subject of a famous Victorian picture by Lady Butler, which was always hung in the mess of the 57th Foot, but has now been lent to the School of Infantry. Incidentally, the losses in this battle were so heavy that next day the rations for one company were drawn by a drummer boy in the little round cap which they used to wear in those days. So, in this program on trumpets, bugles and drums, we'll start with the drums, and in particular with James Blades. He enlisted as a drummer boy in the Northamptonshire Regiment in the First World War and took the King's shilling. Then he went home and told his mother, who went straight round to the vicar. The vicar went to the recruiting office and told them that Jimmy was underage, and anyhow his father was fighting in the Dardanelles. So Jimmy was out of the army again within 24 hours. Now he's Professor of Timpani and Percussion at the Royal Academy of Music and has written a definitive work on percussion instruments and their history. And in the world of orchestral musicians, he's the greatest drummer of them all.
Of course, exactly where or how the drum began, we don't know. The most primitive drum we know of is the drum of the earth, one or more holes in the ground, beaten on by the palms of the hand. This sets up a boom of vibrating air. After that, or with it, the banging of a hollowed tree trunk, sometimes fashioned to produce two distinct notes. Soon, someone, somewhere, stretched a skin across the opening. The hand, we may suppose, came before sticks, as it came before spoons, and the variety of early drums beaten by hand runs into thousands, in all shapes and sizes, in wood, in pottery, in metal, and made from gourds, some shallow, some deep, some very small, and some enormous. Some are single-ended, some double-ended. African drummers, using early types of drums, are still with us to prove how effective they were. In China and Japan, too, drums were used in religious rites and were an essential instrument of war. They were used to intimidate the enemy, encourage one's own troops, and to signal orders. In Japan, particularly, the drumming techniques are extremely subtle, and in India, too, drumming reaches the peak of perfection. Here's an example of the Indian tabla, really two drums played by one performer. India has produced massive kettle drums, one pair of silver being 5 feet in diameter and weighing about 450 pounds. These were magic drums carried on an elephant. The kettle drum came to Europe by way of Persia and Arabia. During the Crusades, Europe picked up the drum for military use and picked it up in two main forms: the kettle drum, ancestor of our orchestral timpani, and the tabor, ancestor of the side drum or snare drum. Of course, the tabor was also taken up by folk dancers and minstrels. In general, the beats were rather simple. That simplicity transferred itself to the military side drum, which had two functions: to keep time on the march and to transmit signals. Before long, techniques were devised to tighten the head of the drum still more. It then became possible to produce a greater variety of beats, above all, a close roll, built from a double beat with each hand, known as daddy-mammy.
The drummers themselves became very important indeed. At the time of Queen Mary, around 1550, a military writer said,
"They shall be faithful, secret, and ingenious, of able personage to use their instruments, and office of sundry languages, for oft times they be sent to parley with their enemies. If they should fortune to fall into the hands of the enemy, no gift or force should cause them to disclose any secret that they know. They must oft practice their instruments and teach the company the sound of the alarum, assault, battle, retreat, skirmish, or any other call that of necessity should be known."
In Cromwell's new model army, there were 2 drummers to each company, but they were not required only for drum calls. Sir John Fortescue, the historian of the British Army, has made it clear that they were regularly employed in all communications with the enemy. So they were expected to possess not only discretion, but some skill in languages. They received far higher pay than the common soldier, and if they did a tenth of what was expected of them, they were worth every penny of it.
The first element of drill the young infantry recruit learned in the British Army was the march in step. Up to the 7 Years' War, he marched at the old pikeman's pace, 80 to the minute. Here's the Old English March, as it was called.
Let the pikeman march with a good grace, holding up his head gallantly, and let his body be straight and as much upright as possible. And in this sort, all the ranks ought to go, sometimes slowly, sometimes fast. So shall they go just and even, according to the stroke of the drum.
That pace was 80 to the minute. It was later increased to 100. But even that is a very steady pace compared with the modern infantry march of 120. And it's quite a crawl against the light infantry pace of 140. Back in the 17th century, the French Marshal Briand criticised the English march for being so slow, to which Sir Roger Williams replied that, slow or not, it had taken the English through the length and breadth of France. When the British advanced to the attack in the 18th century, the drums beat and the men moved forward with the slow and measured step for which they were famous in Europe. And as one French general said to a fellow commander who was new to warfare in Europe, be careful of those redcoats, they're dangerous. The British were trained to respond to the drum as to a spoken order. If the drummers got the wrong order, the men still followed the drum, as they did at the famous Battle of Minden on Lammas Day, 1759, during the 7 Years' War. The commander-in-chief of the Allied forces was Ferdinand of Brunswick. He sent orders to the 6 English regiments, and when the time came, their advance should be made with drums beating. But the order, as it came to the drum major, was, the regiments will advance to the beat of the drum. To Ferdinand's surprise, the 6 regiments advanced immediately. Then, in Sir John Fortescue's words, when all were deployed, the drums again began to roll, and the first line advanced in perfect order towards the French horse, moving proudly forward into a crossfire of more than 60 cannon. For 200 yards, gaps were torn by the guns. Then the 11 squadrons of the French cavalry started into life and bore down straight at them. The battalions closed ranks, halted and stood firm, until the French cavalry were within 10 yards, then fired a murderous volley, reloaded, and at the sound of the drums moved on. Charge after charge was rolled back. In an hour, the French centre was utterly broken. But back to the drums. You may have noticed that at the trooping of the colour, the honour of the first order is given to a single drummer who marches out and gives the drummer's call. Thereafter, at the trooping, all orders are given by voice these days. But up to the end of the last century, anyhow, a whole parade could be controlled by drum beats alone. Here are some of the orders.
Orderly sergeants to take up positions as markers. Call the roll. Attention for the commanding officer. Stand at ease.
One routine call was never popular with certain men, defaulters. That is a distinct enough call, but in the field the calls were even sharper and more distinct. To show how unmistakable the calls were, Jimmy Blades will beat the English call, followed by, since we were often fighting them, the French. The call to arms, for instance.
This is the French call to arms. The English commence fire, and the French.
According to the old drummer's manual, the dinner call was a beating of the roast beef of old England, though that wasn't often on the dart sheet, I can assure you.
The same drummer's manual prints out the first call of the day, the camp taps. This, it is ordered, and I quote, must be repeated from right and left of the line by a drummer of each regiment and returned back from left to right previous to the reveille. Reveille is headed the Mother and Three Camps and Scotch Reveille, to be beat all through in ordinary time. Here's a portion of the Scotch Reveille. It's from Samuel Potter's original manual, printed in the year of Waterloo, as are the other drum calls.
Old soldiers remember the regimental bands playing the retreat at sunset, or at least the bugle or trumpet sounding retreat. But before there were bands and bugles, the drums beat the retreat. Indeed, the ceremony is still known as beating retreat. And far too soon after that, to two, or the first post, or the watch-setting call was beaten. All these were the same call and meant that the soldier had to drink up and get back to his quarters, the equivalent of time, gentlemen, please, in the civilian world. Something of the dignity and a good deal of the panache of the drummer's ancient role as herald persisted for a long time in the British Army, and indeed it has not quite faded out yet. The youngest drummer boy has a touch of swank on parade, and this increases by rank up to the impressive swagger of the drum major, and on to the senior drum major of the Guards himself, whose presence could outface kings. Partly this rests on the traditions of the drummer. He was the executioner when a soldier was to be hanged or when he was flogged, and there were regular floggings in the army at one time. The corps of drummers beat out a long roll as the soldier was turned off the scaffold, or while he was being flogged. In the early days, discipline was terribly harsh in the army, and the gatlap was the cruelest punishment of all. A whole regiment was paraded. Ranks were opened and turned inwards. The unfortunate culprit was bared from his waist up, and he had to march between those ranks, each man belaboring him in any part of his body he could reach. The cries of the victim were supposed to be inaudible drowned by the continuous beating of the drums during this horrible punishment. Many men died from it.
The drum itself always kept some kind of symbolic value. The tenor and bass and side drums of the infantry, like the kettle drums of the cavalry, were, and still are, emblazoned with the regimental crest and battle honours. In the field or at camp, the drum was draped and served as an altar. The soldiers were paid out on the drum, and this long-standing custom still stood when, as a boy, I accepted my first professional engagement in a small circus. On Fridays, my wages, when there was anything in the kitty, were counted out on the drum. The soldier was recruited by the beat of the drum to these taps.
If he turned out a bad one, and he had to be very bad, he was drummed out of his regiment. This meant that he was paraded, sometimes with a halter round his neck, to remind him that he was luckier than some, and made to run the gauntlet between two lines of his comrades, each man helping him along with a rope or belt or a musket butt. The smallest drummer boy gave him a farewell kick. Throughout this affair, the drums beat the Rogue's March. One of the most famous occasions when a drum head was used was after the Battle of Blenheim. Churchill, before he became Duke of Marlborough, of course, was commanding the Allied forces. He'd been in the saddle all day controlling the battle. When it was won, he turned to the nearest troops and asked for a drum. The 5th Irish Dragoons happened to have captured some drums from the French, and one of these was handed to Marlborough. He put it on the saddle in front of him and then searched for some paper. All he could find was a bill of fare from an inn where he'd stayed 1 or 2 days before. And it was on the back of this bill of fare that, writing on the drum, he sent back one of the most historic messages that ever came from a commander in the field. It was to his wife Sarah, and he wrote, "Please convey to Her Majesty that her army has just won a great victory," etc., etc. Hitherto, the French had dominated Europe, and Blenheim marked the end of this domination. The bill of fare can still be seen in a glass case at Blenheim Palace. From the beginning of the British Army, the fife was used with the drums on the march. Small bodies of men used just one fife and one drum, sometimes drum alone, never fife alone. There are still drum and fife bands in the army, but the solo drum for signals and calls is only heard occasionally today. It's a matter for the discretion of the individual commanding officers. Up to the last century, some of the most famous marches seem to have been recognized when beaten out by drum alone. One was the Grenadiers' March, not to be confused, of course, with the British Grenadiers. There are many references to this march in the history of the British Army. At the siege of Seringapatam on the 6th of February 1792, when Captain Monson pushed into the town and occupied a redoubt, he signalled his position to the rest of the column by beating the Grenadiers' March.
We've rather concentrated on the ubiquitous side drum, but in the military band there are two others. The first is the bass drum, the timekeeper, whose importance has been recognised by the addition of a leopard skin to the uniform of the drummer. The other is the tenor drum. The tenor drum is rather larger than the side drum, but it has no snares and is played with soft-headed sticks. The tenor drummer makes great play or flourishes with his sticks, taking some of the attention away from the big bass drummer. The cavalry have kettle drums. We can trace the kettle drum back to before the dawn of history. Always it is a skin stretched over a bowl of wood or earthenware, or, in later times, of metal. As the naka, it appeared in England during the 14th century. It was taken over by concert and dance musicians, used as a stimulating sound in tournaments and as a noisemaker in battle. It became the prerogative of royalty and nobility. Henry VIII was very fond of them. By the end of the 17th century, armies mounted them on carriages, very elaborate vehicles, some of them. And in the English army, only the corps d'elite were allowed to use the kettle drums. The timpani are the orchestral equivalent of the kettle drum, and relics of the old exclusiveness of the kettle drums and of the trumpet still persist. For instance, trumpets and kettle drums may not be included in an orchestra playing in London's Guildhall unless royalty is officially present.
We don't know much about the very early history of the trumpet, but we can guess that it was developed from the great variety of horns already shaped by cattle, goats, and sheep. And the oldest metal trumpets surviving in museums are not much more than straightened-out horns capable of only a few notes. But the metal workers soon refined on their model and added various shapes of mouthpiece, so that the notes could be held steady. The Crusaders had been much impressed by the lavish use of trumpets in the Turkish army. But some form of trumpet had already drifted into the courts of Europe long before the First Crusade, since kings, lords, and princes spent much of their time at war. The trumpets and the drums passed naturally to the troops, with or without the presence of kings and princes, the drums to the foot soldier, and the lordly trumpets to the cavalry. The trumpeter was a herald, or rather grander than the drummer, and with at least the same language and other qualifications. In times of peace, he and his fellows gave colour and dignity to processions and ceremonies with complicated flourishes, as the trumpeters of the army still do today at the more stately banquets, at coronations, and on such occasions as military tattoos. Here, for example, are the fanfare trumpeters of the household cavalry. From such elaborate displays have descended the more sober salutes in the present War Office Manual of Calls for the trumpet and bugle. The royal salute is solemn and slightly menacing. For a field marshal or general, the last 12 bars of that salute are deleted. A rather livelier salute announces a lieutenant general or a major general. All army routine field calls, that is, calls outside camp and quarters, whether for infantry, cavalry, artillery, or armoured units, are sounded on the bugle. All generals, from field marshal down, are accorded the same general salute on the bugle. If no generals are present, there's one salute for all occasions, including salute for guard. Those are the only remnants of the ancient fanfares the British Army has kept, and the sole survivor of the once florid processional trumpet music is the flourish when marching past, for mounted parades only. But although the British Army cut down the decorative and ceremonial calls, it greatly expanded the use of the trumpet for signalling orders. At first, there were only 6 of these calls, and they seem to have been borrowed by Cromwell's new model army from the German mounted mercenaries, or reiters, of the 15th and 16th centuries. These 6 were, one would say, the bare essentials, taken in sequence and using the calls as they now stand in the 1966 manual. They make a short picture or perhaps an imaginary film. The troop has settled down to bivouac in the early evening, and the leisurely mess call is heard. Fine, but the next call is the alarm for troops to turn out under arms. But the troopers being turned out, the trumpet sounds the call known throughout Europe in the 17th century as butter seller, corrupted by the British Army into boot and saddle, by which title it appears in our manual. The German mercenaries and Cromwell's model army used the trumpet for all 6 calls. The bugle hadn't even been invented, but since the order to mount is a field call, it is now sounded on the bugle. And the 6th and last, maybe the last call our troop of mercenaries or Ironsides ever heard, was the charge. A large body of cavalry to be manoeuvrable needed very many more signals, although small groups were easily handled by voice and the follow-me principle. Cavalry didn't charge from the halt, The first order given was walk, followed by trot and gallop. The charge was usually delivered at a steady pace rather than an all-out furious gallop. If the line or column of the enemy was broken and began to run, the order was often given to pursue. From pursuit, the cavalry were recalled by the retire. But the British cavalry were notorious for not waiting for the pursue call and ignoring the order to retire. There were exceptions, of course, but often once they were launched in a charge, they couldn't be controlled. In the Peninsular Campaign, Wellington was continually infuriated at their headlong impetuosity. In the words of Jack Weller's Wellington at Waterloo,
There was no appreciation of the professional duty of an officer in cavalry regiments. They insisted on thinking of combat as a kind of glorious fox hunt. Their men were not slow to follow their example.
incidentally, at Waterloo, Wellington rode along the line giving his orders with his own voice. And when at the end of the day the time came for the British and Allied armies to advance, he took off his hat and several times waved it decisively forward. The bugles took up the call to advance, and the sound has to be heard against a great din of firing and cheering.
Quite complex orders were given in the field by bugle as head of column change direction half right. And a number of orders for the handling of weapons as draw swords, slope swords or sling lances.
During the wars with Napoleon, the cavalry scorned the bugle and used their trumpets in action whenever they could. The trumpeter's place in the field was by the side of his commanding officer. In the Maratha Wars in India in 1803, the trumpets of the 29th Dragoons sounded the charge against a Lasawari fort, and in July 1812 it was the trumpet which sounded the charge for the heavy brigade of cavalry at Salamanca. The infantry, of course, kept to the bugle, and during the Peninsular Campaign it trained the Portuguese troops in its use. When Sir John Fortescue visited Portugal in 1912, 100 years later, the Portuguese army was still using British words of command and British army bugled calls. After 1815, the trumpet was firmly confined to sounding the routine calls of the camp and quarters, though no doubt some cavalry COs ignored the order. Not until 1895 were the calls codified in the first edition of the manual issued. In the old days, the whole life of a regiment was controlled in the infantry by bugle calls, and in the cavalry by the trumpet, starting in the morning with reveille. I remember very well as a young officer when we were occupying Germany after the First World War. As I was returning to camp after a night's amusement, which had gone on far too long, hearing the call of Charlie, Charlie, which was our reveille, echoing across the fields. Usually the bugle begins the day with the rouse, an imperative get out of bed. Recruits had difficulty in sorting out some of the calls, particularly if they were tone deaf. The call for buglers differs only in the timing from the fall-in, and although it goes at twice the speed, it does illustrate the importance of tempi. Buglers. Fall-in. The call for trumpeters is unmistakable and very like a short fanfare. All the calls associated with the care of the horse are set out in the manual, and they are still used by the household cavalry and the King's troop of the Royal Horse Artillery.
Stables. The watering call. Hay up or litter down.
Some calls are the same for bugle and trumpet. The post call, for instance, known by the troops as letter from lovely Lily, letter from lousy Lou. And here's the sick call, the same for trumpet and for bugler. But most of the calls are completely different, as between bugle and trumpet.
Defaulters.
Nearly all the bugle calls and some of the trumpet calls have words. None is printed. Some are unprintable. Even in these days, they've been handed down from generation to generation of buglers, and some generations have invented variations. Apart from the natural army instinct to knock or parody, which is not the way the army puts it, the words were used to fix the call in the young bugler's memory, since buglers seldom read music. Trumpeters, on the other hand, are now usually musicians, playing some other instrument in the regimental band, so that for many trumpet calls, the old words have been forgotten. But we got some experts who remember them. Corporal Travers, looking magnificent in the scarlet uniform of the Chelsea pensioners. He was an infantry bugler just after the 1914 war. And bugler Rangeley, Colonel's bugler in the 2nd Battalion of the Light Infantry, Royal Anglian Regiment. And our two trumpeters, Student Bandmaster Norman Rogerson. He used to be the Colonel's trumpeter in the Cavalry Regiment. And Corporal Mick Brown of the Blues and Royals. That's the Household Cavalry, of course. They're talking to W.J. Waters, who also had the distinction of being Colonel's trumpeter at one time. He recalled the nervous strain when you're a young trumpeter standing outside the guardroom, waiting to blow a call which you can't for the life of you remember.
If you have the words in the back of your mind, it's a great help. Yeah. For example, stables. All men who are able, come down to the stable and water your horses and give them some corn. For if you don't do it, the captain will know, and you'll get yourself into a bloody fine row. And then, 84, 94, he'll go sick no more, the poor bugger is dead. Sick call. Fall out. If you want to have a piss, fall out. How about pay call? Oh, come and get your pay. Oh, come and get your pay. The sergeant major's on the beer and he wants to get away. What kind of words do you put to your calls in the light infantry, Michael?
Well, there's a band call which goes, now, if you see a bandsman, kick his bloody ass.
Yeah, listen.
Well, you could get the officer's mess dinner. The officer's wife gets sugar and spice, the corporal's wife get nothing. And the sergeant's mess dinner. Tom Tucker, you dirty old... Tom Tucker, you dirty old fool.
What's that one? I know it's an infantry call. Pick 'em up, hot potatoes. What's that one?
Second dinner call. That's the second cookhouse for the men's meal. Second men's meal. Oh, pick 'em up, hot potatoes, pick 'em up, hot potatoes, come.
There's that one at the guard room. Stand to attention, you silly recruit. You made a balls up at the general salute.
Well, we have got different words to that as well, you see. I mean, fall in the old guard, the new guard has come. It's been 24 hours since the last one begun.
An addition on that guard call. Turn out the old guard, the new guard's come. Don't give a bugger what the new guard's got.
And then there's, you can be a defaulter as long as you like, as long as you answer your name.
Yes, and then there's also a guard mount call. Is come and do a picket, boys, come and do a guard. If you think it's easy, boys, you know it's bloody hard.
The bugle, as we know it today, developed from the bugle horn, which was borrowed from the German Jäger regiments towards the end of the 18th century. This was a hunting horn of naturally curved shape, with no pretensions to be a musical instrument. And it has not survived to our own time except as a badge of distinction for light and rifle regiments. In 1801 it was ordered that all movements should be carried out by a signal of bugle horn in the experimental rifle corps then being trained by Sir John Moore of Corunna fame. The rifle and light infantry regiments became the elite of the army, not bowing very noticeably even to the guards. Some of the most famous of these regiments were disbanded in the recent reorganization of the army. Others have survived in the light infantry division by amalgamation. Each regiment, battalion or corps has its own call with which all routine calls are prefaced. Most are short. The longest is that of the Life Guards. A characteristically short call was that of the Welsh Regiment. Apart from the old regiments who have lost their identity and their individual calls by amalgamation with other regiments, some have been disbanded. We will salute one to stand for all, the Durham Light Infantry, whose motto was faithful. Its call was. The Green Howards neither amalgamated nor disbanded. The Parachute Regiment uses the Wagnerian motif. Each unit of the Royal Armoured Corps keeps its old cavalry regimental call, some on trumpet only, as the 1st Queen's Dragoon Guards. Some have calls on trumpet and bugle, as the 4th 7th Dragoon Guards, which uses 2 regimental calls. The Women's Royal Army Corps has not only a tune, but one based, it seems, on the chorus to Clementine, whose words you'll remember are, "Oh my darling, oh my darling." Apart from guard duties, alarms, and fairly infrequent night exercises, in peacetime the active army day ends with the lowering of the flag at sunset and the sounding of retreat. Some regiments parade the band or the pipes or the corps of drums to beat retreat, marching and countermarching on the parade ground. The actual call is the same on trumpet and bugle, but only the artillery sound retreat on the trumpet. The first post, known to the bugler as to two, is the signal to drink up and head back to quarters. The trumpeter calls the first post by the ancient name of watch setting. The second post, and the last call on the trumpet before lights out, is a not too subtle variation of the first post. In the same way, the bugle to two first post is a variant of the last post. The last post is perhaps the best known of the longer bugle calls. It's the most poignant call of all, because there can hardly be a soldier in the British Army who has not heard it sounded when one of his comrades had been given a military funeral. last call of all. Lights out.
Trumpets, Bugles and Drums of the British Army was compiled by Francis Dillon and presented by Lieutenant General Sir Brian Horrocks, with James Blades and J.W. Waters. The trumpet calls were blown by Student Bandmaster Norman Rogerson and Corporal Brown, and the bugle calls by Bugler Rangeley. The drum calls were played by James Blades and Eric Allen. The Chelsea pensioner was Corporal Travers, the reader Frank Duncan. The programme was produced by Douglas Cleverdon.